With the NVIDIA presentation of the 3090, 3080 and 3070, the GPU market has reshaped considerably. Unfortunately, the number of 3080 available worldwide was equal to the number of spatulas in Jensen's kitchen. I mean, a lot, but not enough for all of us. But for now, relax. There is no rush. Don't fall into the consumistic trap. Just because everybody wants it and it's hard to buy because stock is so limited, doesn't mean it's automatically a good buy for you. Let's answer to the most important question. Is this the perfect GPU for you? This is Fact Check, the channel that helps you make the best purchase decisions in the tech world. Are you ready to dive in? Let's go. So really, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is whether we are buying the GPU for gaming or productivity. Let's start with gaming. The biggest factor to consider here is whether you're playing action-adventure games that have at their core the storyline, the breathtaking visuals, or you're playing esports and first-person shooters where visuals play a secondary role. Let's first tackle what I call action-adventure games, and I want to mention a very polarizing topic between PC gamers, which is consoles. Given that we excluded the cases where mouse and keyboard inputs offer an arguably superior aiming precision and control, I wouldn't look down on consoles at all. And I have a confession to make, just between you and I. Don't tell Reddit. If I were considering a high-end GPU for gaming and gaming alone, I would lean towards the consoles instead. And let's not forget the ability to play first-party console exclusives such as the likes of The Last of Us 2. Don't get caught up in the idea that you absolutely need the best of the best GPU to have a great time. Exceptional graphics are good and all, but they're just a means to tell a story, a means to facilitate our immersion into an imaginary world. But that's not what ultimately emotionally moves us. As humans, we can read a book which has the worst possible graphics among all the GPUs and still get absolutely caught up into the story using our imagination. Just as in life, it's better to appreciate the amazing parts of the games rather than brood over some grass that doesn't look perfectly photorealistic. And honestly, I find the highest quality game ever made to be The Last of Us 2, and that runs on a modest PS4. So I think that even the most hardcore PC gamer has to agree that Xbox X and PS5 will be able to offer a high quality next-gen gaming experience, and in order to have a comparable or better PC, you'll have to spend much more, approaching 3 times as much. And frankly, I would say the experience with a console overall is leaner and simpler. You just buy the console and know the games will play adequately since they're designed for that specific hardware in mind. You don't have to do any research at all, but you probably don't mind that since you're watching this video. Food for thought. Let's get back to PC though. The main thing you have to consider is what screen you plan to pair with the GPU. It would make little sense to not being able to fully appreciate the performance of bleeding edge high-end GPUs only to pair it with a mismatched monitor. If you have a 4K 144Hz monitor or 120Hz TV, or you plan to buy one in the near future, I would say that the 3080 is almost the perfect card to match. If you have that sweet disposable income, even the 3090 is rationalizable. Leaving aside the 3090, which lives in the land of diminishing returns, the 3080 offers the next best 4K experience right now. There are simply no other comparable options. Although it's very unfortunate that Nvidia paired it with 10GB of VRAM. There might not be a lot of significant examples, barring Microsoft Flight Simulator, where games would use more than 10GB at 4K right now, but we truly are at the borderline. Doom Eternal with Ultra Nightmare texture settings use about 9GB. This is the most significant downside of the 3080 in my opinion, along with its power consumption. Consoles have 16GB of VRAM for their APUs, and let's say, very conservatively, that they're equivalent to at least 10 GB on a discrete GPU. Those will probably become the mainstream reference for game developers, and I'm afraid that quickly 10 GB will not be sufficient for textures of the highest quality settings for games on PC that might wanna push the visual fidelity even further. If only the 3080 had at least 14 GB of VRAM, it would have been a much more future-proof option. Looking at the $400 price tag of the PS5 Digital Edition that has 16 GB of GDDR6, 10 GB of VRAM look a little bit underwhelming, don't they? Rumors are piling up with the possibility of a 20 GB 3080. There are also rumors of a 16 GB 3070. My problem with that is that for gaming, 10 GB might not be enough, and 20 GB might be unnecessarily too expensive. I would have loved an optimal middle ground. Let's see if the rumors materialize after the 28th of October AMD event, or perhaps whenever the 3090 demand slows down under the supply capabilities. Nvidia likely wants to sell as many as of the $1,500 3090s as possible to wealthy customers that want more than 10 GB before putting out a cheaper alternative. But let's talk about price for a moment. $700 for a GPU is a pretty penny, but let's not forget this is not actually the full picture. If you're building a new high-end gaming PC, first I would definitely wait for the AMD presentation of the Zen 3 CPUs and then decide between those, a 10th generation Intel, or perhaps an old Zen 2 CPU that might go on sale. I think that a reasonable high-end configuration one can do right now for gaming is with a 10700K, and it would set you back around $1,800. You might shave off $100 by going with the 10600K for about the same gaming performance if you don't care about those 2 extra cores. I know I personally do though, and maybe you can optimize another $100 here and there, but that's really it. If you splurge for a G-Sync 120Hz OLED TV for what is probably the ultimate gaming experience, you are looking at another $1,500 in the case of the LG CX48. I would personally not use it as an all-around computer monitor for the possible burn-in issues, but modern OLED panels should be suitable for gaming, let's say 4 hours a day for at least 5 years, if one doesn't forget not to unplug the TV, but instead leaving them on standby for at least 10 minutes, since OLEDs do run compensation cycles after a shutdown to prevent burn-in. I personally love the OLED picture quality. The only downside I see for gaming is price and that they are uncomfortably big to be on the same desk as your mouse and keyboard. If we are instead looking at a 4K 144Hz IPS monitor that has a good color gamut, we are still in expensive territory. Something like the LG 27GN950 cost $800. This is a lot, but these are really the kind of monitors you should be looking at to fully appreciate what these high-end graphics cards have to offer. If you already have a system, one possible problem would be if you have a 600 watt or lower power supply. This is not a sharp line, of course, as it depends on all the other components in your system and whether your CPU is overclocked or not. As a rough reference, an overclocked 10900K at 5.2 GHz can get crazy high at almost 320 watts under load, but the other, more reasonable consumer CPUs, especially the Zen 2 ones with less than 12 cores, are usually under 110 watts, and even the 3900X and the 3950X don't go over 270 watts when overclocked, and usually are well under 200 watts if not. As for the 3080 overclock, it's kinda pushed to its limits already. In fact, the overclocking results confirm that the cards are able to unlock around a measly 3% improvement for around 10% more power consumption without disabling power limits. That's really not worth in my opinion, considering also a louder operation unless you're doing it for fun. Instead, I would definitely consider undervolting and even a slight underclock, since there is likely a sizable power consumption decrease with a negligible loss of performance. Optimum Tech showed a video where he manages to have a 3080 run alongside an overclocked 10900K at 5.1 GHz on a 600 watt power supply, where he plays Battlefield 5 for 30 minutes and sees if the power supply shuts down or not, and he was okay. On the other hand, Dave 2D said he had problems with his 600 watt power supply. Personally, I would like my PSU to cover the worst case scenario in a synthetic test at full load for an indefinite amount of time. If you have a 650 watt power supply, you should most likely be fine with a 3080, especially with an undervolt. But I wouldn't risk going any lower just to have some margin and peace of mind, as well as being into a more efficient operation range of the power supply. If you have a Ryzen 3700X or similar, you should be okay even down to 600 watts. If you happen to need to buy a new power supply though, I would go for a high quality 750 watt one, just to be sure. In that case, you need to take into account another $140, or perhaps you can also consider going for the 3070, which is rated at a reasonable 220 watts and save some cash. If you want to upgrade your existing system and want to know if your CPU is a significant bottleneck, as a rule of thumb, any unlocked 6 cores from Intel is truly fine. The 7700K is borderline, but stepping down to anything lower than that and you're usually leaving performance on the table that would make the $700 3080 not worth in my opinion. From AMD, a reasonable pair would be the 3700X or better. The 3600 is still okay and the 3300X is borderline, and from the 3100 or the 2000 series and any lower, and I would really not recommend getting a 3080 without upgrading the CPU first, since you're basically paying for a bleeding edge GPU without getting its full benefits. Two features that might play into a purchase decision are ray tracing and DLSS. I would judge the 4K ray tracing performance of the 3080 to be borderline. It perhaps needs another generational improvement for it to be truly relevant at 4K, even without a super sampling technique. The current iteration of DLSS 2.1 is actually pretty good in my opinion, when developers properly implement it, such as in Control and Deliver Us the Moon. It's reasonable to assume its adoption in games with actually good results will just increase over time. The whole Nvidia software stack, despite being perhaps criticizable for being largely proprietary, it is likely appealing at least in one of its parts, being it RT Voice for streamers, CUDA for GPU acceleration for CAD users and video editors, CUDA's curated documentation for the developers, and of course the aforementioned real-time ray tracing, DLSS, as well as many others. AMD has an answer to some of them, like OpenCL, and almost certainly will bring hardware-accelerated ray tracing with its 6000 series of GPUs, but I wouldn't bet it can best Nvidia on their first attempt. They're also likely to be working on an answer to DLSS as well. Still, I would say that Nvidia software stack has an advantage over AMD, if any one of these features are of interest to you. The 3070, in my opinion, is borderline for 4K. We know Ampere excels at 4K, but 8GB isn't really cutting it, especially as it's also a downgrade to GDDR6. In my opinion, if you have the budget, the 3080 is worth the $200 MSRP difference, but I would definitely consider the 3070 if you are in one of the following cases: if you have a 600 watt or lower PSU, if you have a small form factor PC case that would choke off with 320 watts, or if you have a 4K 60Hz panel. And lastly, if you don't really care about playing with the highest quality textures available. If you are dead centered on the 3080 and you're building a new PC, add to the $200 another $50 price difference to account for the extra quality and capacity of the power supply, and round $20 per year in electricity, considering a 4-hour per day use. If you want to spend potentially less, you should be considering the used market. Although I feel that generally Nvidia cards keep a much higher sale value compared to other PC components. High-end cards naturally still lose a lot when better new options on a cheaper price point are available. My evaluation for a used 2080 Ti is around $420, but with its 11GB, that card might even have a slightly more longevity than the 3070 if they perform roughly the same. It is still a phenomenal card. It was just arguably overpriced new. All used evaluations are under the assumption that the budget allows for the 3070, the cheapest latest architecture, and the hypothesis of normal availability, definitely not the actual conditions as of September 20, but I think October has to be way better, for AMD launch is imminent. I also think that Nvidia will do what they can to have as much supply as possible for November to compete with AMD, and given the console launch, I also guess that the demand will also come just a little bit down. Also, the fact check evaluation for the $200 to $300 bracket for used cards might change in the event of a 3060 launch, and I'm sure the market prices will change as well. So as a recap, if I had a 120Hz plus monitor or TV, the 2080 Ti is where I would cut the borderline, but for a 60Hz one, anything above the 2060 Super is great. I would also include the 1080 Ti, and from AMD I would add to the search list the 5700 XT and the Radeon 7, a great card for 4K that excels for productivity and compute thanks to its 16GB of HBM2 memory. Again, with 8GB cards, you might not be playing with the highest quality textures, but it's a compromise that might well be worth it for the cash savings. 4K gamers then have these options. For gamers with high refresh panels, I would call the 3080 10GB the best GPU available today. For what I would say is a reasonably priced high-end. But you need to accept that you might not be playing with the highest texture quality settings even as soon as 1 year from now. Coupled with the fact that Ampere availability in the near future looks a little bit gloomy, you might as well wanna wait for the AMD announcement on 28th of October to see how they compete, or wait and see if Nvidia decided to launch a 3080 20GB and a 3070 16GB. Fancy a glass of wine? For 60Hz panels, the 3070 makes a lot of sense, and the used market can provide very good opportunities. Now, let's take a look at 1440p. The Ampere lead shrinks a little bit at 1440p, so the FPS gains over the 2080 Ti are not that huge. I think that with action-adventure games, there is not much benefit in going past 144Hz. Still, if you have something like a VA 240Hz panel and you kinda want to give it some meaning, the 3080 is your best bet. Otherwise, for a 144Hz monitor, the most suitable card should be the 3070. Its 8GB of VRAM are also adequate for 1440p and will most likely be so for a longer time than 10GB for 4K. If you can find a used 2080 Ti for what you feel is a significant discount from the $500 mark of the new 3070, it should perform roughly the same according to Nvidia, but I would speculate that that statement is for 4K and that the 2080 Ti might have a slight edge in some games at 1440p. But you likely make a good purchase and a good match to a 144Hz monitor with G-Sync, even going down to a 2070 Super or a 1080 Ti and the 5700 XT from AMD. But for these types of games, you can still have an amazing gaming experience even with a 60Hz panel. With that, I would extend my search to a 2060 and a 1080, considering also searching for a 5700 and a 5600 XT. If budget is tight, I think the 1660 Super is a nice card as well. It also makes sense to buy them new, since it will probably be a while before we see Ampere in new cards under the $300 mark. If ever, since the architecture is really tuned for high resolutions. But if you manage to find Turing or Pascal used cards at what you feel is a good price, that's even better. In that case, I would search for the 1070 Ti and 1070 as well. The panorama in the used market for you, as you can see, is much broader than the 4K case. Your option though also include again waiting for the 28th of October AMD presentation. If you don't mind uncertainty and have no rush, a possible 3060 that might slot in the $350 to $400 price range might be an optimal purchase if you wish to buy a cheaper new card with the latest architecture. As with the 4K case, I would wait for the Zen 3 CPU presentation to make a decision for the CPU and motherboard. You might want to go for a 10600K and cut $100 with almost no gaming performance penalty today, but I really think that $100 are worth it for an upgrade to 8 cores for more longevity, and that extra oomph in other productivity softwares that you might use now or in the future. For monitors, I would go for a 144Hz IPS one. If you also play esports with a very competitive mindset, or you really enjoy super high refresh rates in FPS games, you might consider very good VA 27-inch 240Hz panels like a Samsung Odyssey G7 that does both very well. But competitive esports are usually played at 1080p to reduce the total system latency as much as possible, since GPU has less work to do. In fact, you might also consider having a separate 1080p panels just for esports instead. I would also argue that 24-inch is the sweet spot for competitive games. If I already had a system and if I were shopping for up to a used 2080 Super, I wouldn't obsessively worry too much about CPU bottlenecks. This is because I wouldn't spend more than $340 in these conditions. Again, this number is just indicative, but that would mean not losing a ton of value due to an underperforming GPU. Not because the bottleneck is not there, mind you. For a given GPU, the CPU is increasingly important as we go down the resolution and as frame rates go up, and the CPU has to do the work in a tighter time frame. The solution to a potential bottleneck though, namely a new CPU plus MOBO, would cost potentially even more than the used GPU itself. If you can't find benchmarks for your system before the purchase, it might still be worth it to buy the GPU and then evaluate the situation by comparing your frame rates to some benchmark with the same GPU with a modern processor. In that way you can gauge how much performance you would unlock by making a CPU plus motherboard upgrade. Also, it's smart to do so once AMD launches Zen 3 and the used market starts to provide some good opportunities to solve your eventual bottlenecks at a more reasonable price. In the case of the 2080 Ti, the 3070 or the 3080 though, I would definitely wait for Zen 3 availability and make a more attentive evaluation of the CPU bottleneck for my use case. But as a rule of thumb, for those graphics cards, I would really want at least an overclockable 6 core from Intel from 8th generation onward or better. For AMD, I would want a 3700 or higher. Last thing about 1440p. This is where I think ray tracing starts to be a real possibility even with cheaper cards. For that I would personally want a 2070 Super or better. The 1080p discussion will be very brief. Ampere would be totally overkill. At most I might consider waiting for the 3060 just in case you absolutely want a new card with a new architecture. Other than that, the used market is your friend. You might even consider top Maxwell cards, although in my opinion the market price doesn't really reflect their value. At a certain point the price ladder is so compressed that it's usually better to climb it up to at least $120 if budget allows it, because there is simply not enough room to shrink the price even further. This is also because the sub $200 market for new cards is kinda neglected by AMD and Nvidia. There are unfortunately not a lot of desirable options, and therefore the used market reflects this, for there are simply no other good alternatives. I will repeat myself in saying that I find going beyond 144Hz to not bring much value for action-adventure games. For a 144Hz panel, I would really pay attention to the CPU I'm using, since the GPU difference shrink at 1080p resolution. Frame rates are pretty high anyways, and definitely almost all games are playable with any mid-range Turing and high-end Pascal GPUs, even at the highest quality settings. For these reasons, I would focus the budget on the CPU first. The CPU panorama I would target is the same as the 1440p case. If the CPU situation is sorted out, I would say that if one manages to find a good deal on a 2070 Super at my evaluation of $270, that would make for an exceptional purchase, and for the Pascal generation the top 1080 Ti is a monster for 1080p. Extending the research down to a 2060, which I value at $170, or down to a 1070 won't make a significant difference in terms of the gaming experience, but the potential savings might be considerable. Of course, the most optimal purchase depends on your personal judgment and on the prices that you are able to find. As for a new system, the panorama changes a little bit, since I can't recommend you to overpay for a GPU when you won't probably get a performance benefit. The 5600 XT is the most expensive card I would personally buy for a 1080p high refresh rate screen. I would also consider a 1660 Super if I want to reduce the budget a little. A reasonable modern system for high refresh rate 1080p would be a 3700X and 5600 XT. You might optimize by going to a 3600 and perhaps even a 3300X and don't lose a lot of gaming performance. Maybe go with 16GB of RAM, but it would just hurt me to go under 8 cores for a new system in late 2020, since it's not that expensive and there is a baseline consisting of a PSU, case and motherboard, and to a certain degree RAM, which contributes to a considerable percentage of your expense. And that means that even in the case where performance for a CPU or GPU scale linearly or even with diminishing returns, the price to performance curve for the whole PC doesn't start at the origin anyway. Still, I feel that going over $1,000 for a 1080p system is a little bit too much, and too close to a 1440p capable one. That's why, even if this price is optimizable for sure, I think that with so many options on the used market, I would avoid buying new and search for the used market for at least some components, most notably the case. For 1080p 60Hz, I think it's almost a crime buying new. Mid-range Pascal are what I would search for the used market. At this point, I wouldn't even worry about the CPU bottleneck too much. Now let's do some CD ... and let's analyze what are the optimal GPU choices for competitive esports and first-person shooters. This category, as stated, is very broad, and I would like to establish a ladder reference from more demanding to less demanding games. The upper limit is the category of first-person shooters such as Battlefield 5, Doom Eternal and similar that almost fall into the types of games where visuals play an important role. Here you kinda want both the visual quality and the high frame rates. For those, it's safe to take the previous section considerations as a good starting point and refine them upwards the GPU performance food chain if the FPS benchmarks for your specific games don't satisfy your appetite for butter-smooth gameplay and your budget allows it, or go down in resolution or quality settings as you see appropriate. Having addressed this in between cases, I want to focus on competitive games where you might be very invested in the ranking system. Climbing down this performance requirement ladder, we find PUBG and Apex Legends, then Overwatch, Fortnite, CSGO, and at the bottom we find Rocket League, Dota 2 and League of Legends, which are very light on the GPU. But given the fact that the last three are very easy to run at very high frame rates on almost any modern discrete GPU, we won't focus on those games. I'll just say that for those I would search for a very cheap used mid-range Pascal or high-end Maxwell. You might get away with even less computational power, but I wouldn't get any lower for prices are so compressed that it's really not worth it. Since we are hopefully having a reasonable discussion, even with Ampere I couldn't consider 4K to be a suitable resolution to play esports with a competitive mindset. Also, I would focus on low quality settings without distracting eye candy. In fact, playing at 4K not only does reduce the frame rates, but also introduces more total system latency. The amount might vary, but according to Linus Tech Tips, is what I would consider very significant. Considering also that to my knowledge there are no 4K monitors that push beyond 144Hz available to consumers, I think that anyone playing competitively would pick 240Hz over 4K any day. A solid argument might be that 144Hz is also fine for most people. In that case, one might consider getting a 4K monitor and play with an upscaled resolution. I don't know if upscaling introduces significant latency. Probably integer scaling might be the most performant method since it doesn't involve further calculation, but without actual latency test, one can't say for sure. For this discussion then, let's consider 1440p resolution as a borderline case, since going 4K most likely will result in an overall worse experience. Take the data, especially for PUBG, only as a ballpark reference with very significant margins of variability. Esports FPS data is usually all over the place, and these are also often from different systems, different seasons, different maps sometimes, and of course different gameplays. So before a purchase, if you really want a very accurate evaluation, double check by searching for benchmarks for your use cases for the CPU, RAM and GPU of your interest. For PUBG and Apex Legends, some optimal options are either the used market, or if you really want a new card and the budget is not really a problem, you might try to wait for the AMD announcement on the 28th of October or for a possible 3060. The 3070, if availability and budget allows for it, it would definitely do the job very well. But again, I think the most sensible option is to look at the used market. If budget is more limited, don't feel that you would be missing much by extending the research down to a 2060 Super, a 1080 and a 5600 XT. These are also the cards I would target if I had a 144Hz panel. I would personally draw the line there and would rather go down to a 1080p resolution than sacrifice the frame rates. For Fortnite, Overwatch and CSGO, any modern mid-range card performs exceptionally well. I would likely target the 1660 Super, 1070 or a 5500 XT. Going below it, it's not really worth it unless budget is very constrained, but I would likely evaluate slightly better cards on the used market if prices are close or if you play at very high levels. For CPUs at 1440p, I would likely target the 7700K or better or the 3300X or better. The 3300X can also be bought brand new and it should be sufficient for most. It's rather cheap, but its availability is rather scarce. If you can't find a 3300X, I would wait for Zen 3 and evaluate between what is announced and something like a 3600 or a 3600 XT. As for RAM, if you're building a brand new PC for esports and esports alone, 16GB are more than enough, and I would rather get high-speed memory over more capacity, especially with AMD. The impact of RAM speeds, though, is also something that should be explored beforehand on your games of interest, if you want to very precisely optimize the cost to performance metric. The 1080p discussion for esports is very simple. If you got a 240Hz panel and play PUBG, Apex Legends, you should be looking at a 2060 Super, a 1080 Ti or a 5700 XT as the cards that would fulfill your thirst for frame rates. Just make sure you have a CPU that doesn't bottleneck your system. If you have a 144Hz panel, you can't go wrong with a 1660 Super, a 1070 or a 5600 XT. For Fortnite, Overwatch and CSGO at 1080p, the GPU is simply not a limiting factor, except perhaps for very entry-level models. If I were buying new, I would get a 5500 XT and call it a day. But even if budget were not a problem, checking the used market for a 1060 or an RX 580, at least for the environment, is really the right thing to do. We came a long way since the beginning of the video. Now we truly can make an optimal purchase decision. If you decided that Ampere is the right match for you, there is one last question that you might be wondering: Founder Edition or third party? This is the eternal form versus function dilemma. Or is it? This time around, the Foundry Edition cooling is actually truly advanced, and for how much more compact the card is, I really think it is an outstanding achievement. Of course, brute force cooling also works. The third-party models have massive heatsinks and also a third fan. You can get approximately 16 degrees of difference under load with the ASUS TUF 3080 OC in comparison to the Foundry Edition, and this is at approximately the same noise levels. That's quite a lot considering also approximately 20 watts extra due to a slight factory overclock. And if you have the space in your case and don't care about aesthetics at all, it is the right choice. I would personally get the non-OC TUF model. In theory, the ASUS TUF non-OC is $50 cheaper than the same OC card, which brings it to the same $700 price of the Foundry Edition. I find the overclock on these cards very unnecessary and would rather have a quieter and fresher room in the summer instead. But this is personal preference and might depend on where you live as well. I mentioned the ASUS TUF card because it's one of the cheapest model, and the reviews I've seen so far are rather positive. Also, the design is not nearly as bad as some other AIB models. If only it didn't have the obnoxious TARS graphics on the backplate and those huge white writings with a very unaesthetic font, I could even call it the most pleasing and minimalistic third-party design. I'm in love with the 3080 Foundry Edition design. To me, it's a work of art. Will I buy one? For now, I'll have to politely decline Jensen, despite the tremendous effectiveness of Nvidia marketing in building up the hype. Personally, if I were building a new PC, I would go with the 3080 Foundry Edition and a 4K high refresh rate IPS monitor, but since I already have a system, I personally don't need a new GPU at this moment, as I'm perfectly satisfied with what I have. And I think this is the first question anyone should ask themselves. There is always something better, newer and shinier around the corner, but that shouldn't deprive you from the appreciation for what you have, and not make you believe you can still do amazing things with the tools at your disposal. But if the upgrade moment has arrived for you, this is truly a fantastic time for a new GPU. Let me know in the comments what you have decided to do. Tell me your optimal purchase decision. If you want to know how Ampere stacks up in productivity, subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss that video. And finally, if you found this information valuable and worth sharing, like this video to let the YouTube algorithm know that you enjoyed it so it can suggest it to more people. This is Fact Check. Never make a suboptimal purchase again. But I guess if you have a Ryzen 3700X or similar, you should be fucked.